Today on Cornell Keynotes, we are looking at ways that hybrid teams are often mismanaged and how best-in-practice organizations are overcoming those challenges. What makes this episode a standout for me is how our guest, Brad Bell, from Cornell's ILR School, provides actionable steps toward hybrid team success that you can apply to your practice right away, including developing a shared understanding among your team, bringing clarity and unity to the mission, how to establish and maintain a hybrid team identity while creating an inclusive social climate, how to bring more people into the leadership process, and finally, how technology can make your hybrid team more agile and responsive. So check out the episode notes for a link to eCornell's online hybrid work strategy certificate. And now, here's my conversation with Brad Bell. You say that managing in-person teams involves something very different than managing teams in a hybrid environment for the obvious reasons. But beyond that, what are the material differences? How do we think about this philosophically? What's the difference?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's important to highlight upfront, Chris, first, this isn't entirely different, right? And we've been doing virtual teams for decades. People have been working remotely, telecommuting, doing remote work for decades as well. So some of the foundations were in place well before the pandemic. But I think what's really changed post-pandemic is this explosion in these hybrid work arrangements. So it's no longer just the kind of mix of in-person and remote, but it's also these people that are really kind of oscillating back and forth between these two different types of work arrangements. And I think that really leads to kind of three key differences that we've been looking at in our research, and we refer to as the 3 V's. So the first is variety. What you find in these hybrid teams is much more variety in terms of the nature of different types of work arrangements that people have. Of course, some people are going to be fully in person, some may be fully remote. But then again, you have these people that are in these hybrid arrangements. And even within that bucket, you have a lot of variety. Some people might be in the office 1 day a week. Other people might be in the office 4 days a week and everything in between. So much more variety. Second is volatility. What you get when you have these hybrid arrangements is now I don't know where people are necessarily going to be on a given day. In the past, I knew you were a remote worker, so I'd have to connect with you via technology. I knew these other people I'd see in the office. Now with hybrid work, I don't know where these hybrid workers are necessarily going to be on a particular day unless a company has things like anchor days or specified days for in-office versus remote. And so that unpredictability of these arrangements is a new kind of challenge that I think we're wrestling with.
Can I ask you something about that? So what that involves is a certain diligence on the part of management.
Right.
How is that perceived, right? So then suddenly you have people kind of micromanaging your whereabouts. I mean, ideally, a high-functioning team, there's trust involved. You're going to get the work done. That's cool. We'll figure it out.
Right.
Has this introduced any new problems for people not being used to this? Oh, I feel like I'm constantly being asked where I am right now.
It can lead potentially to this kind of monitoring effect, right? Where you feel like you're kind of always being watched. Again, I think some organizations have addressed this by saying, we're going to have those specific days where people are going to be in the office and these days are going to be at home. I've also seen technology solutions. I've worked with companies that now have it where you can go and you can see through a dashboard, here's where my team members are today, right? Are they in the office? And increasingly, companies are even going to these flexible seating arrangements. So it might be they're in the office and they're at this workstation today. So I think there's ways to get around it where it's not, hey, I need to check in every day and, tell my boss where I am, that can provide that transparency or that clarity around where people are sitting.
And that unburdens management too. I mean, let's be honest.
Right.
I'm going to be out for an eye doctor appointment. I'll be back in 45.
Sure.
Doesn't take much to do that.
No.
Right.
Yeah, and I've heard from a lot of managers and HR professionals that say they're just getting tired of kind of policing this. And it's not viewed as high value added work. So yes, we need, again, it's important for a team to know where their members are, but the ways we can do that seamlessly and without much kind of manual tracking, the better.
In your research and interactions with industry partners, I imagine at this point, right, we're 4 years out of COVID taking place. You've probably got some historical data to report on any big picture things that you observe. That's kind of beyond what the obvious stuff that we all kind of collectively know. What have you seen recently?
I think one is just how rapid and dramatic a change has been for organizations and employees. Prior to the pandemic, data shows that about, employees are spending 5% of their days on average working from home. And so that meant most people were working in the office most of the time. That jumped to 60% during the pandemic, and it's leveled out at about 30% of all full-time days are now spent working from home. That's equivalent to about, if you kind of look at the way remote work was gradually, ticking up over the years, that's 40 years of growth in remote and working from home in a couple years. So that's been a dramatic shift for everybody to deal with. I think the second big kind of change or leveling out we've seen is early in the pandemic, it was what was going to be the new normal as we got, beyond this. Was it going to be full-time remote work? Was it going to be bringing everybody back in the office or something else? And it's clear now it's something else. It's the hybrid work model has emerged as a dominant model. 45% of employees are in that arrangement. About 35% are back in the office full-time and 20% are fully remote. So I think that hybrid model is clearly where we're going to be, going forward. And I think the last one is this continues to evolve. I think as organizations experiment, as they figure out what works, what doesn't work, how much kind of structure there needs to be around this, they continue to modify their policies and practices. And some of this honestly changes based on the prerogatives of who's in charge. There's a great example I saw recently in the media where a new mayor came on board in Philadelphia and she decided that she wanted all city workers back in the office and mandated that, set a date. It was challenged in court, but was determined to be management prerogative. So now all these employees had to come back when they thought they were going to be, working from home full or part-time. And so that happens in corporations as well, where a leader kind of drives the change.
You've devised a list of 5 things that we can do to address some of these shortcomings, some of these areas where we can get some wins. Number 1 is shared understanding. So what are we talking about? How might that help what we see here?
Sure. So, we know that one of the keys to success of any team is to have what we often refer to as a clear course, right? Everybody needs to know what we're trying to achieve, what are our goals, what are our mission, how we're going to get there. And I think in traditional in-person teams, sometimes that just occurs or emerges organically, right? Through discussion, through interaction, through shared experience. But that, again, because of all the issues we just saw in the word cloud, challenges with communication, challenges with connection, it can be difficult to build that shared understanding. And so hybrid team leaders really need to be purposeful about doing that, taking the time with their team to really sit down and make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of here's where we're going, here's how we're going to get there, here's a role that you're going to play, and revisiting that and making sure everybody stays on the same page throughout the process. Because if you don't do that, what you're going to get is people that have different views of what is the team's goals, how are we trying to do it, and the team's going to be going in a million different directions and ultimately probably won't achieve its objectives.
So I don't want to get too tactically in the weeds, but I have a certain experience with this kind of thing. We revisit our objectives and our mission quite often. I think if you were to do it more than quarterly, would that be weird? Like, how are people doing this?
I think it varies on the team in terms of, just how dynamic is the environment that the team's operating in. I mean, it might be for some teams, they need to do it weekly because they're just working quickly and things are changing so rapidly. Other teams that maybe have a longer time scope on the work they're doing or a more stable environment might be quarterly. It might be once or twice a year. So it's hard to specify a specific timeline, but the important thing is to really establish it up front, make sure everybody's clear on it, and come back and revisit it. In particular, when new team members come on board, right? When you have those changes in your team membership and dynamic, you need to recognize those people aren't on the same page as the rest of the team, and you really need to take the time to do that and to do it in a purposeful manner, because it's not going to happen through osmosis as it might in a traditional in-person team.
And any manager worth their salt can kind of look around and say, they're not doing what's strategically required of them right now. So maybe I need to set them straight.
But that's an interesting point, Chris, because yes, that happens in a traditional team. A manager can walk around, look, and talk to people and know when the team's going off the rails. As I think we're going to touch on a little bit. That's harder to do in a virtual and hybrid context, again, because people are out kind of working on their own a good chunk of the time. So even more reason why you need to set that clear course for the team, because as a manager, you're not going to be able to constantly be kind of bumping people to get them, online. So I think that's why it's really one of the foundations for successful hybrid work.
So number 2, hybrid team identity. What do you recommend here? What's the problem that we're solving? How useful is identity? What's the point?
One of the big risks, one of the challenges we find with hybrid teams, virtual teams as well, is that they can easily fragment, right? So what we end up with is cliques, we end up with silos, we end up with people that are sitting out on an island by themselves and aren't really integrated into the team. And that can, again, create conflict. It can lead to people having different viewpoints on what we should be doing or accomplishing as a team. And so, again, part of the reason why setting that course, having that shared understanding is so critical is so that we have that clear team identity. This is our team. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. This is our mission. Because if you don't have that, it's very easy for these teams to bifurcate, and it can be very hard to get everybody back on the same page. The other thing we also find with hybrid teams is they tend to be more diverse because we're often pulling in people from all over. They might have different backgrounds. They might be sitting in different countries. So that diversity can also make it harder to establish a common identity. And so having kind of what we often refer to as a third culture. So everybody might have their own individual cultures and backgrounds, whether that's functional, geographical, but raising that up to have a third culture for the team that everybody identifies with, and that creates the unity within the team.
I'm also thinking about this from a bigger picture internal kind of thing, right? So I'm on a product management team. I think we do a pretty good job with our team identity, and it's very useful for all of us internally. But we have a pretty strong brand within the organization so that everybody else understands very clearly what we do. And
Sure.
I think that's probably useful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's fascinating research that's done a decade or so ago that found that a lot of people don't even know who's on their team, and people outside of the team certainly don't know who's on the team, right? So having that clear identity and knowing this is our team and making sure that's clear to others in the organization, I think to your point is really essential.
I have my org chart on my desktop.
There you go. That's one way to do it.
Yeah, it is. So there's another aspect to this, something that you call social climate. How is this distinguished from the other two that we just talked about? You had suggested supporting the social climate of your hybrid team is the leader or manager's job to build trust, member well-being, and stuff like that. So that's where that responsibility lies?
I think so. I think what we know about any type of virtual interaction is that it tends to be much more task-focused than relationship-focused. So, we don't have those kind of spontaneous interactions. We don't have the discussions before the meeting starts or after the meeting ends. It tends to be very get down to business, focus on the agenda items at hand. And what that can do is really make it difficult to build relationships and social connections. Again, going back to that word cloud, we saw connection, social, communication, cohesion. That's all kind of endemic of this problem that we have in building tight relationships, building a really kind of supportive social climate in these settings. And so this is a place where virtual or hybrid leaders really need to be purposeful about doing that. What we've seen is a lot of teams try to do it through these events. We're going to have a virtual happy hour. We're going to get together and build a banjo, whatever it might be. and not to say those things aren't valuable in some cases. What we're finding is that actually what's much more valuable is building it into the regular rhythm of your team. So take 5 to 10 minutes of every team meeting and just have open discussion like you would if you were gathering together in a conference room before the meeting starts. What are people up to? What's going on in your lives? What did you do this weekend? What vacation are you going on this summer? And by doing that, we get to know each other as people. We get to know people on a personal level beyond just the professional. And that's what builds the social connections and those social relationships.
Sometimes it's easy to think of that stuff as corny or cheesy. We're doing another goofy group activity. What is this all for? Mm-hmm. But it is. It's not enough to do your job, right?
Yeah. But I think that's also the point of building it into the regular rhythm of the team. Because I think when it's, hey, we're going to carve out this time and we're all going to have a virtual happy hour, coffee hour, that seems forced sometimes and it seems artificial. But if it's what we do as a team is we spend 5 minutes at the beginning of every meeting checking in, how's everybody doing, what are you up to? Then it just becomes part of our natural operating procedures. And I think that reduces that ickiness that sometimes people get about those kind of team building types of activities.
Next point. So this is number 4, leadership process. You had suggested that a leader should encourage team members to participate in the process, maybe a little more delegation of duty. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by this? I like this one.
Yeah. So I think a knee-jerk reaction of many leaders when they get in this context of leading a virtual hybrid team is, well, I can't see people like I normally would. I can't do management by walk around. So I really need to, I need to micromanage. I need to really get my hands on this team and make sure I really kind of monitor. And you even see some organizations go as far as putting into place monitoring technology where we're tracking employees' keystrokes and things to know if they're working throughout the day. That's a whole nother topic. But what evidence shows is that that's actually the wrong approach for managers. As teams become more virtual, as they become more hybrid, they actually perform much better when members feel empowered. They feel like they have autonomy. They feel like they can make decisions. And in part, that's because leaders, as we talked about earlier, can't be as hands-on in this context. They can't monitor in the same way. They can't intervene on a daily basis. So what they really need is kind of eyes on and hands off. They need to be kind of watching how things are going, stepping in when needed, but really need to encourage their employees to make decisions. They need to solicit their input actively. They need to give them responsibilities, in terms of managing the team and taking on different parts of the teamwork. Two caveats though, Chris. One is we don't do this on day one. This is as a team develops and matures and gets to a point, you do this gradually, right?
Yeah.
And the second, as I alluded to, is this doesn't mean that all of a sudden I get to a point where as a leader, I'm totally laissez-faire. I'm monitoring, I'm making sure things are kind of going in the right direction, stepping in as needed. But the point is to encourage the team to take on more and more of that self-management role.
Hybridization of a team, from what I understand and what I've experienced, is we've got a lot more tasks all of a sudden, right? There's a lot more digital organization of people, building meetings, sharing docs, getting our workspace going, all that stuff that would normally take place. But it's been my experience. That's kind of a good quick win, right? Once there's been trust established, the leader has, done all the right things with the team, just to relieve themselves of some of that stuff must make an impact.
Absolutely. And I think that builds confidence among the team members, but it also helps build trust between different team members because they see different people stepping up, taking accountability, taking responsibility. They know, hey, I can depend on Chris. I've seen Chris take on these tasks, perform them at the standard that we would expect. And now that starts to build that trust, which is really critical because we don't have that line of sight always into what each other is doing in this virtual context.
Number 5, agile technology. What are we talking about here? We all use the tools, right? We're all online.
Sure.
Where does the agile, why is that so critical?
I think the agile is important because we know that teams, what they're working on at any given time, their environment, these things are going to change. And so we need to be careful not to have our pet tool or technology that we go to in every situation and at every time. We need to be aware that we might adopt a tool or technology that turns out not to work so great for our team and be willing to change that. We often have people across maybe different generations or different levels of comfort with technology. So really kind of making sure as a leader, you're kind of monitoring how these tools are being used, setting clear parameters and expectations about how they should be used effectively. For example, if conflict emerges in the team, do we want people trying to resolve that through email or Slack? Probably not. We want them to jump on a Zoom call or if possible, to get together the next time in their office and resolve that because we know that face-to-face communication is much better for resolving things like conflict. So having as a leader kind of clear guardrails for how the technology should be used and thinking about how you might need to modify the technologies themselves over time is really critical.
Peter asks maybe the most complicated question of the day, but you alluded to it just a moment ago. Peter asks, how do you handle staff conflict in a virtual setting? Now, let me back up a little bit. Are there certain types of conflicts that do emerge within a hybrid setting just because of the nature of the work that we do?
I'm not sure that there's necessarily new types of conflict that emerge in hybrid settings. I think to Peter's question, I think the bigger challenge is how to deal with that. And I think the first thing you need to think about as a leader is what type of conflict are we talking about, right? Because there's good conflict and there's bad conflict. Good conflict is task conflict. We are having disagreements about the work, about things that we're doing, ideas, etc. That's actually productive. If we create a psychologically safe environment in our team, we want challenge and debate. That's key to team learning and creativity and innovation. What's bad is relationship conflict, when that conflict spills over into the interpersonal. And that's, again, where I think using the wrong technologies to try to deal with that's where you start getting these people misinterpret language. They misinterpret things in email because these are not rich communication mediums. That's why I think it's critical when that interpersonal conflict arises to deal with it in person. Manager might need to get involved to really help kind of mediate that. But I think that is where the use of technology really needs to be aligned to the challenge the team is facing.
Yeah, right. You need to have what's equivalent to the office talk once in a while
Right.
with somebody, right?
Sure.
Shouldn't have done that on Slack. Let's figure this out.
Yeah. And I would also say to Peter's question, the best thing you can do is to try to prevent or avoid conflict in the first place. And that's why setting that really strong foundation, have a strong team identity, setting a clear course for the team where everybody's kind of moving in the same direction. Not to say that conflict isn't going to pop up from time to time. It always does. But by having that foundation, you can probably rein it in much more quickly because
Yeah.
you have clear kind of norms and expectations and values established in the team.
So in your hybrid work certificate program that you've recently updated, how do you structure teaching this kind of stuff? You and I met earlier this week and you talked about the different courses within it and some of the themes that you cover in much more depth than what we're doing here today. Can you
Sure.
tell me a little bit about that? Because I think that's instructive for our audience, whether they take the certificate or not, to think about some of the things that you're just going to tell us about in a moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I was really excited to work on this certificate because it was myself and two of our other faculty, Donna and Theo Mary. Donna is in applied economics and management. Theo Mary is in the Johnson School. And so the way we set it up is the first course really kind of gives a lay of the land, a common language to think about hybrid work. You know, here's the different ways it can exist. Here are some issues and challenges that we might face. Donna then really digs into the team dynamics piece. So how do you set up and kind of monitor and evaluate effective team process and performance in this environment? I then get into leading and managing these types of teams. And Theo Mary is an expert in communication. So she just, pertinent to our discussion we were just having, how do you communicate? What types of tools should you be using in different situations? And so I think it really covers the full span, but nicely also builds in these projects and applications throughout so you can assess your own teams, you can figure out where challenges may lie, and a ton of tools and frameworks to have you kind of dig in and resolve those challenges in your teams.
Hey, I've been asked to provide some clarity for Jessica and Richard, who missed the third V.
Oh, yeah.
So we had variety and volatility. What was the third one?
Yeah, I don't think we got to the third one.
We didn't?
I think you asked me a follow-up and we didn't get to it. But the third one is volition. So we talked about variety. We talked about volatility. Third one is volition. By that, we mean control or choice. And what we find is in hybrid teams, there's often some people that have a lot of control over determining their work arrangement, and others, by the nature of their jobs, maybe based on the nature of their tenure with the organization, don't have that choice. And our research suggests that when you have these differences in volition or choice or control across a hybrid team, that's problematic because what that does is it creates perceptions of unfairness, creates perceptions of inequity within the team. Sometimes that can't be avoided. Sometimes people just need to be on site given the nature of their jobs. What's key for a leader or an organization is to communicate, here's why you have to be there, right? We're saying you need to be on site and here's why, giving that rationale, making sure that explanation is transparent. Because if you don't do that, people make up their own explanations, which often veer into, oh, it's because of favoritism, it's because of other things like that are non-job relevant and lead to those perceptions of unfairness.
Early on in the conversation, you had suggested, and we were thinking big picture stuff, trends observed over the last 4 years, the way things are. I haven't heard anybody say the new normal in quite some time. So that was a little triggering to hear that. But so hybrid is here, right? David asked something that we touched on a little bit, which is thoughts on how to encourage in-person engagement. So, for the Philadelphia mayor who made what sounds like a pretty misguided move, maybe it'll prove to be, it'll work or not. How do you approach this kind of thing when you feel like your organization works better when there's more people in person?
Yeah. I think, I mentioned earlier what we've seen among a lot of organizations is, I think in the early days of the pandemic, as we were implementing hybrid work, it was somewhat of a free-for-all. We were going to let each team, each manager kind of dictate what they wanted to do. We were going to let people decide which days they wanted to work from home or in the office. And it was all over the place. And that made it really hard to get employees back in the office at all, because a lot of employees, what they found were, I'm going to go into the office today and none of my team is here. I'm interacting with everybody I have to interact with through Zoom. Why am I in the office today? And what we're seeing is a lot of organizations now specifying those anchor days, or at least teams specifying those anchor days and set days, so that there is more of a value proposition for employees to be back in the office. The other key kind of enticement that I would give to employees, one thing that research has shown pretty clearly, if there's a downside to remote or virtual work, it's career advancement. People that work more virtually tend to progress in their careers at a slower rate. Out of sight, out of mind. They don't get the prime assignments, just proximity to their leaders. So I would say if people care about advancement, if they care about, kind of moving forward and getting those choice assignments, that having some of that in-person engagement and interaction beyond just how it's going to benefit the team and its ability to do certain types of work, I think is a good argument to put in place. And I'm hearing more and more companies, particularly for more junior talent, kind of conveying that message, that it's best for you to be in the office at least sometimes.
I didn't know how I was going to make you say it, but when I was driving in, I knew that we were going to talk about how important optics were.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's just, I don't think it's a conscious effect often. I think it's often unconscious, but we know proximity matters. We know that, unfortunately, I still think, being visible and putting in the hours, so to speak, be up above and beyond what you're actually producing from a tangible output. I hope we get to the day where people can be totally evaluated on what they're producing and their outcomes. But we're still at a point where a lot of it's FaceTime. That's just unfortunately the way a lot of our evaluation occurs still within organizations today.
Perfectly useful for employees and employers. Brad Bell, always a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Chris. A lot of fun.
Yeah, you bet. See you, everybody. We'll see you at the next keynote. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Cornell Keynotes, and check out the episode notes for information on the online Hybrid Work Strategy Certificate, which is faculty authored by our guest, Brad Bell. Thanks again, friends, and subscribe to stay in touch.